Over to you, my friend.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you can all see the screen. So I'm just going to get started. Sam, I can't see you in Newcastle, so if there's a problem, please just let me know and I'll kind of reboot the computer or the router or something. So today what I want to talk about, well, for those of you that might be fans of Lily Allen may recognize the title of the talk, Everyone's at it, so why aren't we? What I want to do is actually talk about the prickly subject of attribution. Because if I was to ask you, or rather, if you were to tell people what you do as a living, they'll turn around and say, well, the hackers are all coming from this country, aren't they? And if I was to do a poll to the audience and say, where do you think most of the attacks are coming from? Chances are you'd probably mention Russia, you'd probably mention China, you'd probably mention North Korea. Basically, you'd start to list the countries that have red flags. No pun intended. But the reality is if we start to think about what's actually happening out there in the world today, literally everyone is at it. And a really good case study for that was actually demonstrated by Citizen Lab a couple of years back. Now, we're really lucky because the work that was being done by Citizen Lab really showcased the offensive cyber operations being done by countries that you wouldn't automatically assume that are carrying out such acts. And I'm going to show you some of their reports. And of course, this is taken from the Finfisher and the Hacking Team breaches, because remarkably, when these organizations were breached, the criminals, because that's effectively what they were, they effectively disclosed all of the information about the customers that these organizations had. And these organizations were certainly providing tools that could be used for surveillance purposes or other nefarious purposes. But like the countries that we have listed aren't the countries that you automatically would assume are the ones that effectively, they don't have red flags. I mean, actually, I don't know what the flag for Mongolia is, but you wouldn't have classed them as in the same category as, say, for example, some of the other nations that we think about. And that's the reality of the world that we live in today. And by the way, this is from 2015 and 2014. So the likelihood is that we've seen, or certainly we anticipate, the use of digital or cyber, effectively, we would call it. But we've seen an increase in the use of that compared to physical warfare. Right? There was an amazing report done by the Department of Defense on North Korea. I think it was like the early 2010s, 2012. And they basically made the assertion that they were witnessing and seeing the growth and rise in digital means for warfare because it provides the government the opportunity to be able to have non-repudiation. In other words, like in the words of Bart Simpson, you can kind of shrug your shoulders and say it wasn't me. And in the digital realm, that's the reality that we live in, because actually doing true attribution is, and certainly only through technical means, is actually almost impossible. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't sit and actually make really good, highly confident assertions about who we believe to be behind these attacks. But that's not quite what's happening today. And of course, we have to acknowledge the fact that there are literally so many nefarious threat actors out there, and many of whom are kind of intermingling. So there's this kind of economy that's occurring today in which very technically capable individuals are effectively guns for hire. And those guns for hire are switching between, APT groups or switching between, criminal or organized criminal groups, really with the purpose of, for them getting paid, but ultimately serving the purpose of their paymasters. And this was kind of recognized actually throughout industry for some time now, and this is actually from Cyber Reason, but the nation states are now using private companies to carry out operations. And of course, these groups do have an incredible level of sophistication. I am on the board for the European Cybercrime Centre, EC3, and the head of EC3, Charles Orting, back in actually a few years ago now, actually made the assertion that there are organized criminal gangs today that have a higher level of capability and sophistication than most nation states. And that's the reality that we live in, is that those slides, and those, some of you may have seen slides today where you kind of see the category of hacker. I hate the word hacker, but they say category of hacker. They say script kiddie. They've got criminal gangs and they've got nation states, and they've kind of got a sophistication line going kind of like inferring that actually nation states have the most level of capability. I mean, that's bullshit, right? And anybody that puts that kind of slide up today really needs to kind of rewind and go back to 2010 and use those slides then and not use them anymore, because it's a very, very fluid environment. And we see and we witness individuals switching very, very quickly. And it's such a fluid space that actually making those assertions, I would argue, can be really quite dangerous and detrimental. And so the world that we live in today, we've got this attribution roulette. And you could argue that actually the attribution roulette today is based upon really flimsy indicators. I mean, I've seen, there was one particular case that I thought was remarkable, in which they looked at the source IP address of the intrusion, and the source IP address was coming from China. And then they turned around and said, yeah, the attack is coming from the Chinese government. Other examples we'll witness is just purely using the time in which criminals are actually accessing an environment, or it's criminals, right? Whether they're nation states or criminals, it's the same thing. And you can't just use single indicators as a suggestion as to who the attributor is or who's behind the source of the attack. And whilst it's been okay in the past, fine, it's been great for generating and creating PR, getting certain companies the opportunity to be able to stand up on BBC News. Moving forward, it's not really going to be an option. And in part because the whole industry is basically going to be turned on its head with one decision. And that decision isn't coming from us as the cybersecurity community or from law enforcement for that matter. It's actually coming from insurers. And I want you just to think about this for a second. Because there's no question that cyber insurance as a risk mitigation approach is viable. But if you can think about it for a second, if you as a company have paid incredibly large premiums, and those premiums are being used to kind of offset the potential impact of an attack against your environment, and all of a sudden the insurer turns around and says, yeah, but it came from a nation state, and that entire policy is completely void, or certainly that claim is completely void, it's going to leave you in a really difficult position. But of course, the question you've got to ask yourself is, well, how are Lloyd's going to determine what a nation state attack is? I mean, well, like Lloyd's is an incredible insurer, but last time I heard, they weren't doing, they weren't reversing malware and determining the likely attribution or source of a particular attack. And you've seen this just recently. I think it was a large shipping company that actually had their insurance denied because it was asserted that it came from a nation state. And of course, they took the insurer to court and ultimately won. But do you really have the time to go through that? And so, as we begin to move forward, as we begin to get over COVID, but really deal with a scenario in a world in which attribution really matters, there is a risk that insurers may just look at the headlines on the register or look at the headlines on ZDNet and just say, yeah, that particular attack came from a nation state. And it's not just a simple case of saying, well, if it's espionage, it's an APT group, and ransomware, it's not. Because actually large nation state groups actually do ransomware attacks. And you might remember WannaCry in 2016 that was asserted by the DOJ to have come from a nation state. So if you suffered an impact through WannaCry and you had insurance, today that wouldn't be covered, and certainly wouldn't be covered if you had an insurance policy like this. And that ultimately is the challenge that we face. And so what I want to do today is really kind of walk you through an incident that I actually worked on, but kind of walk you through how we've done it, or certainly I've done attribution, and some of the things that we should be thinking about if we're going to make these assertions, because actually making these assertions are important. And some of you may be sitting there thinking, well, why the hell would some bloke sitting in a garden room in London like be the right person to be making claims around, an entire nation carrying out attacks against an organization. And so what I want to do with you is just kind of share with you the reason why I think it's important, and fundamentally the steps in the methodology, or certainly a set of steps in methodology that can be used and leveraged. And the example I want to give you is, and I think I published this, but I can't remember, I couldn't find it, so I might not have. But there was a case in which I got called in, it was in 2021, it was early 2021. And the phone call I got was, we think that there's been an intrusion inside our network. And at the time, I was like, well, how do you know? And there's like, well, we're seeing some strange traffic in our environment. And at the time, it wasn't even raised by the CISO, it was just a SOC operator. And of course, the question was, I was working for a software company at the time, a vendor at the time, and they're like, well, you should have stopped it. So I get that a lot, by the way. And so we kicked off an investigation. We started to undertake or go through a set of identifying and analyzing logs, really with a view to try to understand what was happening. And what we found actually was really remarkable, because the attack itself, based upon the analysis that we found, actually started in 2015. In fact, what was remarkable about this particular case was that under normal circumstances, you'd make the assumption that the adversary would basically, wipe everything and leave no trace that they were there. But what happened in this case was they were actually in the environment from 2015. And because they hadn't been detected, we're talking about 7 or 6 years at the time, because they hadn't been detected, they just didn't bother cleaning up. And that was, that was actually a first for me, I've got to be honest. And actually, as we began, just as an FYI, but as we began to do additional deep analysis and additional deep dives into this, it actually turned out that actually they'd been compromised from 2014. But at the time, it wasn't even on the CISO's radar. It was just at the SOC level. And as we begun to do analysis, what we found was actually it was an internet server on the DMZ that had been compromised. They'd obviously managed to gather credentials, and they'd maintained and implemented multiple persistence mechanisms inside the environment. Now, this has never happened before, but obviously, we had the logs, but what was really phenomenal was we were able to find a compressed folder in one of the servers. And that compressed folder was actually being used to submit and transfer information to an infrastructure that we believe to be owned by the Mustang Panda Group, which is an APT group based out of Southeast Asia. Now, I'm not saying it was definitely Mustang Panda just based upon infrastructure, but the data that we found in the exfil folder was like TLP red data, because this was a defense contractor and they were providing information and support for the Department of Defense for that country. I'm not saying it was the US, but for that country. And so now all of a sudden we're kind of dealing with a scenario in which actually we've got state secrets being exfilled to an infrastructure being hosted by another nation. And it was at that point we kind of said, look, we need to get with the CIO, we need to get with the CISO, we need to share with you what we've actually found. And the really scary part was, I was like, look, and this was January, and I said, look, the truth of the matter is that we found the initial entry vector. We found some persistence mechanisms inside the network. But what we need, and you're not going to like this, is we're going to need to keep them in your network. And this was freaking them out, because at this point, the CEO had been called. And by kind of February, March, the Prime Minister's office had been notified. It became a major issue. And they was like, well, look, all we want you to do is throw them bad guys out. And I said, look, if you do that, if we don't sit and monitor what's happening in the environment and find out all of the persistence mechanisms, they're not only going to come back, but the chances are they'll come in and torch the environment. And, when we did the Bank of Taiwan investigation, what we found was actually they were using ransomware as a vehicle to wipe all traces of the threat actor activity. So we were really concerned. And we said, look, if you don't keep the bad guys in the network for at least 6 to 8 weeks, then we're not going to find the additional persistence mechanisms. And of course, this was remarkable, but they actually agreed to they actually allowed us to do that. So we actually sat there like watching these threat actors come inside the environment, drop tools, steal data, but actually allowed us to gather information. And so by the time March came around, we were able to do a golden ticket reset, like delete all of the back doors, and actually, like, touch wood, we've not heard of the threat actors come back. And again, but at the time, I would say our attribution was probably a little flimsy at the time initially. But what we began to do was we began to look at all of the various different indicators and assets in the environment, and we were able to determine who the likely threat actor was. And what that enabled us to do, it enabled us to actually have the discussion at the CEO level. So then we could make a decision and a discussion around, can you allow criminals inside your network to continue to steal state secrets? I mean, that literally was the ask that we had of them. But because we were able to say, look, you're dealing with what we believe to be a state, and if you don't do this, this is what they are capable of. That's why attribution was so imperative with regards to this discussion. Because if we hadn't done that, and if we hadn't given them some indication as to the likely threat actor, you can bet that the SOC analysts would have said, just throw them out, and then the state would have come back in and wiped out the entire environment. I will say my recommendation was to completely torch the network and rebuild it from scratch. That wasn't something they were willing to do. So they weren't completely listening to everything I told them. And so as we begin to kind of think about, well, okay, how are we going to be able to determine attribution? How are we going to be able to do this? One of the things that we do constantly is, we'll look at the MITRE attack techniques, and we map these MITRE attack techniques as a set of TTPs, tools, tactics, and procedures, and allocate those to specific threat groups. And so in this instance, what we were able to do is say, hey, look, the TTPs inside this particular environment correlate to this particular threat group. The other thing that we were able to do, and I think, like, obviously this is the obvious part, but obviously we get the malware samples, we analyze the backdoors. And the other thing, actually, which I think is really key, is doing a source code analysis on the malware and looking at clear overlaps between other attributed samples that we may have, again, begins to contribute towards that kind of picture that we determine to be attribution. And of course, we can look at the times that the threat actors get in. And like, I know I was pretty rude about this particular methodology, but if you add it and contribute towards it, then of course this does help. And of course, this particular time zone was, oh my gosh, it's asking me to update soon, not now. All right. So of course, that does begin to contribute towards that assertion, where we look at the times, we look at the malware, we look at the infrastructure. We were also able to look at the exfil data, and that then allows us to basically determine who we suspect is behind this. Can I just say, by the way, if you are an APT criminal, or you're working on behalf of a state, you don't really do many hours. I mean, realistically, you only really do like 3 days of work a week. And I kind of looked, and we kind of joked afterwards, and I said, blimey, like you got to say, they really achieve a good work-life balance if you are working on behalf of a nation state. Because, I mean, realistically, you're kind of shutting off at 5 p.m. on most days, and you're not really doing much on the weekends. But again, like, that was tongue in cheek, but it does begin to kind of paint a picture. And if we map this out and we kind of say, well, okay, what does this actually look like? We can kind of look at the challenges that we face, but fundamentally, it's all of the above. It's all of the intelligence challenges that we have. So what does this all mean? And how can we begin to do this? Well, unfortunately, from an investigative perspective, our work has become a lot more difficult than it ever has. As I said, like, I'm on the Europol's European Cybercrime Center advisory board. And within that, we published the IOCTA report. And I would say that is a tremendous report. It's actually written by EC3. We have contribution from industry, of course, but it is a law enforcement report. IOCTA is Internet Organized Crime Threat Assessment Report. And what was remarkable was they actually talked about the challenges that they face in conducting investigations. And one of the challenges that we all face now because of GDPR is who has basically gone dark. And so, look, I acknowledge that criminals won't register domains in their own name. Like, I accept that. But from a metadata perspective, it's the first thing we always do. And now with who is going dark, of course, that's not really a viable option as a first step. In fact, you've got to submit an MLAT, which is a mutual legal assistance treaty, in order to be able to get the data. But law enforcement have to do the same as well. So one of the things that I think we need to be thinking of as an industry is, like, with such a fragmented industry, we'd rather attack each other on Twitter than we would kind of get together and work and find out ways that we can actually stop things like who is going dark. And so, like, one of the things that the messages I'd like to get across is, yeah, attribution is really difficult, but not impossible. But what I'd love to be able to do is, like, we as an industry need to be more collaborative. And actually, that's part of the reason why I wanted to do B-Sides, because B-Sides to me is one of those communities where actually it is a supportive community, and it is where we're kind of working together and looking to collaborate together. And so, like, my ask is as we kind of move forward, like, let's continue to in that spirit of collaboration, because I'll tell you, from a privacy perspective, they really work well together, which is why we've seen laws that are protecting the privacy of individuals, which is great, but the unintended consequences, it also protects criminals as well. And so let me share with you what kind of we do today. But there's no product pitch here, I can promise you, none at all. So obviously within my team, we run the Metasploit framework, and some of the tools that you can use and some of the tools that you can access. Obviously, you all know Metasploit. It's free to use. The framework is completely free to access. We've got 4,500 modules that are freely accessible. We also provide scanning technologies. This is all available free of charge. You can access this if you wish. And we also run our honeypots. And, the way that we're currently doing attribution today, and not like absolute attribution, but the way that we're determining the context of an attack today, is we have our honeypots sitting there listening to connections. Those honeypots are gathering TTPs and IOCs, which are then backed and analyzed against our threat actor library, and that then determines who we suspect to be likely behind specific attacks. That context we then use to support law enforcement and other operations. Now, not quite yet, but what I will say is that all of this data will be accessible and available for you free of charge. So if you bear with me, I'll post it on Twitter and so forth when we're ready. But we are making this information available to you as researchers, as academics, in order for you to be able to understand what's happening in the threat space, but also to secure your own environments. And again, this is all free of charge, so please bear with me. I'm like a couple of weeks into the new role, so but we are going to be making all of this data available under open data. I'm going to pause. Actually, I'm going to go to the last slide. Well, I can't actually because it's not working and my laptop's frozen. Fantastic. Let's try this. Okay, let me try again. Sorry. Share screen. That's embarrassing. No, that's not working. All right, it looks like Chrome has completely crashed on me. No, it's not. Okay, it looks like Chrome has completely crashed on me. Let me try that again. Let me see if I can share that once more. I really only had one slide, and then what I want to do is kind of get into a Q&A, but also I'd like to give you, I'd like to make available. Okay, there we go. And so the last slide that I'd like to really say here is that, one of the things that I think is really important from us as a company that actually does have the telemetry is we are making as much of this information available to you. So, from our Metasploit teams, obviously you've got access to the modules, you've got access to in-depth exploitability analysis through Attacker KB. We publish the intelligence report, so we analyze things like time to known exploitation of vulnerabilities, and of course, all of the critical details around emergent threat response. All of this we've made available for you. Please, let me know if there's more that we can do to help you as the community. Like our competition isn't other vendors, our competition are criminals, and quite frankly, we need to work and collaborate together to do everything we can to stop them. Because look, I kind of co-founded No More Ransom in 2016, and Like the whole reason for that is because we live in a world in which, a clinician can open up an email and a hospital will no longer be able to provide patient care. Like that to me is just a scenario in a world in which it's just unacceptable. So let's work together. Let's find ways to collaborate. And like I said, look, reach out and we'll start to make all of this information and content available for you. And like I said, you've got Metasploit, you've got Attacker KB, we've got Velociraptor, like all of these tools that are freely accessible. We will continue, and you have our commitment to continue to provide that to you. Okay, I'm going to pause and open it up for Q&A. Sam, I'm assuming that the internet didn't crash and I haven't been talking to myself over the last kind of 20, 25 minutes. And I do have a book to give away as well, but it's an old book, but I thought it'd be nice to just kind of provide that. So I'm going to shut up for a second and see if you're all still there.
Hello, can you hear us, Raj?
I can indeed, yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was an amazing talk. I cannot believe that we can't just look at the IP address or something and decide to blame an entire government. That you have rocked my world.
But the crazy thing was, so there was an admittance from a UK law enforcement agency that said publicly, if we see that the IP address of a cyber attack is coming from China, we won't investigate it because it's just too difficult. And that was publicly admitted by a law enforcement official.
And it doesn't surprise me at all. But shocking that they would admit it. Does anyone have any questions for Raj? Oh, right.
Thanks, Raj. That was brilliant. Question I had right at the start. You showed the report from Finn Fisher, and you sort of showed the global map of the customers of that tool in particular, and you pointed out that sort of the usual suspects weren't on that list. Do you think that's because the usual suspects just aren't using those tools and they're doing absolutely everything in-house? Or do you think there's something else behind that?
Yeah, so there's definitely a capability gap. Some of the smaller nations are definitely outsourcing, but many of the larger nations would have their own capabilities. And there is a TLP Red briefing that I have in which we've actually mapped out, one nation's entire cyber offensive capabilities and tools and teaming. I mean, it's like some of them are really good. Like they've got entire teams dedicated to OSINT, entire teams like creating fake LinkedIn profiles and phishing people all of the time. I mean, some of these nations have, in fact, I think it was the DoD reference to North Korea, who basically said they're actually investing in cyber as opposed to traditional warfare because it's more cost effective and non-repudiation. So actually, yeah, some of these nations that I referred to right at the beginning have really frightening capabilities.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Oh, hello, you.
On the question on the investigation that you discussed and the importance of attribution in going to the CEO, how much would you say there's a likelihood for chasing for an attribution to go to a CEO with that kind of conversation in mind?
Well, actually, I think, and here's the scary thing. I think it's always required, because the sad reality is what we do as an industry is we are devoid of context. If you think about the logs, if you think about everything that we stop and we see, there's no real context as to what's actually happening. And when we're talking to the business, then they desperately need the context around making those business decisions. And, for us, for me, if we hadn't been able to provide that context, I wouldn't have got to the CEO. They would have basically said, well, you're just going to close off the initial entry vector. And we found about 8 to 12 different backdoors after that. And they had 84 compromised credentials. So we didn't even know that at the time. So I would say that determining context wherever you can is imperative in every investigation, in every case. The challenge is that we just don't have the time and resources to be able to provide context on everything. But I think that's the challenge we face as an industry, because, how many when we were at Intel, I think we had something ridiculous, millions of alerts a day, and we just didn't have the time to understand the context behind those millions a day. So that's the challenge that I think we face, is taking those millions of alerts and getting it to like the 5 or 6 that you really want to focus on that are probably more critical. But like, that's the challenge, is how do you get context to scale?
Thank you very much, Raz. Yeah, I think context isn't technical as well. I mean, when you're dealing with alerts and stuff, it's what does the company do, especially if you don't work for that company and you're coming in as a person, like a remote SOC or a remote incident responder. It can be really, oh yeah, it's fine, we've seen this a million times, close it down sort of thing, whereas you don't realize one of their customers is, and it's a supply chain attack. So context behind everything, it doesn't really matter whether it's technical or like a social thing, is always super important. Any other questions?
So let me share with you a quick story. So I had to do an investigation against a company that had a Soda Nikibi attack, which is the REvil group, the ransomware group. And I mean, I got like pelters. They're like, you didn't protect us, you're crap. Like, I mean, I got so much abuse. And so I was like, okay, well, so what we did was I got the team, we actually did some work with law enforcement on disruption of an RDP shop. And we actually found their creds available for sale in this RDP shop. And I went back to the CIO and I said, well, with all due respect, I said, they'd gone in through RDP 11 months ago. You ignored the alert, and your password for your web-facing RDP system was welcome123. And so context to me is imperative, but the amount of work that had to go into that was not insignificant. But that's the challenge that we face, is that I think, organizations see it as binary, like you're protecting me or you're not. But actually, our challenge is to provide the bit in between. And I will tell you, that was the most enjoyable conversation I've ever had in my career.
Yeah, I've had a couple of them myself. It's awesome. While you're trying not to smile.
We've got another question. Am I on? I'll turn myself off. Am I on? Hello? I'm not on.
You're not on? Where's the question? Oh, Chris.
All right, I have a question, but I will also give context at the end of the question. My main question is, what in your can private companies, in your professional opinion, give accurate attribution? And the reason I ask this is, about a month and a half, I was at the UN in Geneva, and the Deputy Minister of Information Security was very angry at the UN for having private companies participate in the summit. And it was his opinion that only governments should be doing it. And I believe he also told off the UN and stormed off and cursed at some people. So that's the context.
You can't do this without us. And that might sound like the most arrogant thing on the planet, but if you think about infrastructure today, by and large, is hosted by private companies. The telemetry of global attacks are hosted by private companies. So it has to be a public and private thing. There is no other way. And, one of the first takedowns I did with Europol was the B-Bone botnet, and that was a true public and private partnership. We had law enforcement agencies from across the globe. We had private sector companies doing analysis, tracking the threat. We had NGOs like Shadow Server doing the sinkholing. I mean, it can't be done with, it can't just be done with private sector. It can't just be done with NGOs, and it can't just be done with, with public sector. And I think, politicians you hear this all the time, oh, we're going to build our own internet just for us, or we're going to ban encryption, and wake up, it's not. We're in the 21st century, it's just I keep forgetting what year we are, because I think Thanos has stolen 3 years from me, but we're in 2022, and modern policing, modern law enforcement, and digital crime has to be a collaborative effort. And a great example of this is, I always say, look at No More Ransom. No More Ransom was, at the time when it was with McAfee, Kaspersky, National High-Tech Crime Unit in the Netherlands, and Europol, and Amazon and Barracuda agreed to host it for us. and we've prevented, I think, 10 million downloads of free decryptors. And that could not have been done just by us or just by law enforcement. So I'd love to speak to that individual that stormed out. I would love to speak to that individual.
Oh, more questions?
I think I'm on now as well. I am on. Okay, over to you.
It was in the United States about 2 or 3 years ago. They were starting to propose laws about actually hacking back or attacking back on criminal organizations or even nation states. What's your view on that sort of approach?
I mean, well, I guess a lot of it depends upon the infrastructure or really the attribution that you've done. Of course, there is likely to, or there is the potential of the risk of you attacking somebody that didn't have anything to do with it. And so there is that risk. But look, I personally, I think, my opinion is that we need to set an example. And I think actually carrying out offensive operations, I think from private sector's perspective, that's not what we do. I think if governments want to do that, then more power to them. So, I'm not in a position to say what government should be doing, but from a private sector perspective, that's not what we do. And in fact, I was at a conference recently, and there was a CEO of a company who stood up and said to the audience, "Yeah, we actually do hack back." And I was like, "Well, that's actually criminal." But if you feel comfortable enough to say it publicly, then go ahead. But I don't think we should do it. And in fact, I did a piece with the Cyber Peace Institute on following the Ukraine and Russia war around the dangers of we as individuals doing hackback or hacking operations against the Russian state. So I know it's controversial, but what I would say is that that blog is still up there and it kind of articulates my views. But I don't think we should be doing it. I think if governments want to do it and intelligence agencies want to do it, then that's up to them. But for me, I wouldn't.
And it's illegal, so don't do it.
It's a spiky question, man. It's a spiky question, though. But yeah, look, we're there to defend. That is our role. We're there to protect. We're there to defend. We're there to educate. We're there to enable. That is our role. It is not to go and do arrests. It is not to out people. It is not to dox. It is not to, bring down infrastructure because it suits the narrative. That is our role, and I look forward to being flamed later.
Awesome. What a great start to the day. Everyone, big round of applause for Raj Samani.
Hey, Sam, I have a question for the audience, and I'm willing to give away one of the books that I wrote in the past. I'm a huge Sam Fender fan, and I know Sam's from the Northeast. Can somebody in the audience tell me what Canny Chanter means? Because it's in his lyrics for 17 Going Under, and I have no idea what it means. And there is a book in it for you, the first person that came up with an answer.
Canny Chanter.
Canny Chanter.
Wants to try something on.
I'm going to say, let me put you on microphone, Steve.
It's just a person that wants to try something on.
Thank you very much. Sam, if you can share the contact details, I will liaise with Steve and get a book out to him in the next week.
Fantastic. Love it. Well done, mate. All right. That's brilliant. Thank you again so much, my friend. That was awesome. We very much appreciate your time. So there we go. We're off to the races. Keynote 1 in the bag.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Raj.
mate.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, Raj.
Bye.